Hey everyone, this is Ezekiel O'Callahan with Raptor Chatter, and we're going to be looking at what happened in May 2022 in paleontology. And there were actually quite a few things, including a couple of preprints I'm going to mention, which just means they haven't gone all the way through the peer review process. But they still are pretty important, and there's a lot of discussion happening in some of them, so we're going to get to that. But first, we're going to be looking at a paper that came out that was looking at crocodilians from South America, and specifically they were gavialoids. And gavialoids means that they're like the gharial. They generally had relatively long snouts and were much more fish eaters, but these ones are really unique because they actually come from marine sediments, whereas the modern day representatives that are related to these animals, the gharial and the false gharial, are only found in fresh water. There's actually two of these animals that actually come from these marine sediments, so there's a lot more diversity than we may have thought. And the first was already named, Piscogavialis. The other one, though, is entirely new and has been named Sacacosuchus. Based on their presence throughout the entire Pisco Formation and a number of other rock units, it seems pretty consistent that they were a major part of the faunas here from at least 19 up to about 5 million years ago, basically throughout the late part of the Miocene. However, there was a large die-off and change in a lot of the ocean faunas at this time, and then a little bit later into the Pliocene and Pleistocene. So it's likely that these marine crocodilians went extinct around that time. And hopefully we'll get some more fossils and be able to tell that better, because today we really don't have any primarily marine crocodilians. Sure, saltwater crocs can go out into the ocean, but it's not really something they're doing super regularly, and it's not a primary thing that they are doing when they're feeding. They're not spending all of their time there. So these fossil crocodilians are pretty unique and could help us to understand how certain crocodilian groups, including the gharials, actually started to migrate across the world. Evolution is always occurring, and you can actually see that in the modern day moonfish when you compare it to some of the fossil representatives. Now the living one is called Mene maculata scientifically, but there's a fossil from 48 million years ago in Italy that is also of a moonfish within the same genus. It's still Mene, it's just that it's Mene rhombia. And looking at the fossil, you can see that it's pretty similar. And in fact, there were even melanosomes preserved, which means you can use scanning electron microscopes to look at the shape of those melanosomes and figure out what color the animal would have been in life. And you can actually see that it would have been patterned slightly differently. And that's important when understanding modern day moonfish, because modern day moonfish have this kind of spotted pattern, and that's really good for fish that are living towards the bottom of the ocean and feeding on smaller crustaceans and invertebrates at the bottom. Meanwhile, this striped pattern that we see in the fossil moonfish is more indicative of something that was living in the open ocean and was likely hunting other fish. And you can actually see that because this fossil also preserves some stomach contents, and inside that stomach are some sardines. So while these two fish have very similar body plans, we can tell from this fossil that they were living in entirely different ways. So this fossil really helps to highlight how even if we don't necessarily have all the information and animals look very, very similar to one another, there's still change occurring, even if it's not exactly the change we would have first thought of. So the archosaurs includes things like crocodilians, dinosaurs, and the pterosaurs, and some of them have very large heads. And there is some evidence to try and suggest that potentially this is something that they got just as they got larger. And this is especially true of things like the Erethosuchids, which had almost comically large head for their sizes. And so this paper sought to essentially look at femur length, because femurs are normally pretty well preserved, and compare that to things like the skull and see if there is any relationship between the general size of the femur in Archosauromorphs and the overall skull size in those same Archosauromorphs. And what they found was pretty inconclusive, at least on some levels. Pretty much just actually the biggest level. When you're looking at overall Archosauromorphs, you can actually have animals with pretty similar femur sizes, but very different head sizes. Meanwhile, when you look at other groups like just the dinosaurs or just the crocodilians, there's a much more simple pattern going on there, where it does seem like, yeah, femur size does correlate to the head size in these other animals. So there is some evidence that it is evolutionary linked, that the larger head sizes do come from larger sizes of the animal. However, it's not at the base of Archosauromorphs. It's more within those individual clades where you start to see those patterns. Endothermy and warm-bloodedness has evolved a few times in different animal groups. And one of those is at least once in the dinosaurs, because the theropods that are living today, the birds, are warm-blooded. And so there's been this lasting question of, were all dinosaurs warm-blooded? And there's been a strong consensus on the answer being probably. But maybe isn't really a definitive answer for the sciences. So some researchers actually looked at many different specimens that were well preserved and found different biological markers, which isn't to say it's the exact same thing that was in the animal when it lived, but it's at least traces that we can use to understand what kind of metabolism the animal may have had. And what they found is that ancestrally, yeah, all dinosaurs probably were warm-blooded. And by extension, so would have the pterosaurs as well, because those two groups are very closely related. They were probably all ancestrally warm-blooded. However, when you're looking at the rest of the dinosaurs, you do see a couple of different marks on their graph, specifically with things like Stegosaurus, which is notably cooler, and Hadrosaurus, which are notably cooler. And there's a couple of other patterns like this, which does suggest that at least some of the large herbivorous ornithischian dinosaurs seemingly became cold-blooded later on. And this is actually really important when you're looking at some things like the Pachycephalosaurs, because the Pachycephalosaurs are more closely related to animals like Triceratops than to any other dinosaurs. And so what that means with the Pachycephalosaurs being warm-blooded and the Ceratopsians being cold-blooded is that the Ceratopsians became cold-blooded completely independently of the other ornithischians that also became cold-blooded. All of this simply means that there was a lot of variation in how the dinosaurs evolved their different metabolisms. And you can actually see how in the sauropods and in the theropods, they were pretty much warm-blooded all the way throughout. And that's really important when you're thinking about sauropods being these massive animals. So it's not just large sizes and herbivory that led to cold-bloodedness, but there was a lot more going on there that we don't fully understand yet. So this paper is one of the preprints, but I think it's pretty interesting, so I wanted to at least introduce some of the ideas here, because I do think they're pretty solid. Because what these researchers did is they took relatively recent coprolites, including from places like the Grand Canyon where there's sloth dung in some caves. And what they were able to do is DNA sequence that sloth dung, not for plants and not for sloth DNA, but for the bacteria that would have been present in that dung. So essentially they're sampling what the gut biome would have been like in a Shasta's ground sloth. They also used a few other animals, and then they compared those same samples to modern representatives of the same group. So for woolly mammoths, they used an African elephant. For the ground sloth, they used a modern sloth. It's pretty straightforward on why they did that. However, the important thing is they didn't just sample and compare directly. They actually let these animals poop and then left that poop out to essentially dry up and start to decay in a lot of the same ways that these fossil coprolites would have. What they found is that there is a pretty significant bias towards what the microbiome is going to be found in these preserved coprolite specimens, because some of the bacteria die and also get digested as the decay process starts to continue. And so while this is fundamentally a very interesting study that looks at this microbiome of long extinct animals, it also really highlights how you need to compare some of these coprolite specimens to modern day specimens and modern day gut biomes, because otherwise you're not really going to have a full picture because of the biases that exist. So a little while ago, there was a paper that came out that looked at the two earliest confirmed pterosaurs coming from South America, coming from the Triassic, so very early in pterosaur evolution. And there was a little asterisk next to that because there was another animal that was at least thought that it may have been a pterosaur, and that's Faxinalipterus. And this new study helps to show that Faxinalipterus was not in fact a pterosaur, but was closely related, instead being a lagurpitid, which is very closely related and actually the sister group to pterosaurs. So something that was pretty close, and it's pretty understandable that the researchers made this assumption. However, they also purport an entirely new species with which there's not actually any overlap with Faxinalipterus and any of the bones of these two animals. So it could actually just be a different part of Faxinalipterus. And part of that suggestion actually comes from when they ran the phylogeny on these animals. So once again, they found these as being lagurpitids, which is very, very close to the pterosaurs. However, lagurpitids and pterosaurs are grouped in the larger group Pterosauromorpha. And they find that this new animal, Mehari bonaparti, is actually one of the earliest diverging members of Pterosauromorpha. In fact, it's so early that it doesn't fit into either the pterosaurs or the lagurpitids. Now, it is also pretty partial, so hopefully we'll get some more bones of it at some point in order to really piece together what exactly it was and potentially even what Faxinalipterus was. But it is really interesting that we're starting to get more evidence that pterosaurs and lagurpitids were starting to be more present in parts of South America. because most of these fossils actually come from North America, especially very early pterosaurs. So we're starting to learn that they got around the world much quicker than we may have thought, and that they were pretty successful pretty rapidly. Understanding fossil trackways can be hard. And I know that. I'm working on fossil trackways right now, and they don't always show up the best. They're not always a perfectly clean photo of what the print would be. Instead, a lot of times there's a lot of variation that can occur in these tracks. You have underprints and sediment deformation. You have just normal erosion that can cause these things to become damaged. Additionally, you have many different potential source makers. But there are more people doing research on tracks than there used to be. And that's really helpful because they're starting to lay out better protocols for how to recognize tracks, at least within dinosaurs. And the paper also described among the first tracks coming from Palestine, which is actually really exciting because most of the rocks around that area are actually marine rocks. So knowing that they got closer to shore at least some of the time is pretty cool. But they did have to look at a few different things to understand if these were actually dinosaur tracks, because only 2 of them were pretty well preserved and could be more confirmed as dinosaur tracks. The rest of them had to be inferred through a couple of different methods. Now, first, the authors actually were able to show a couple of different examples of why tracks can be so hard to actually understand. For example, these ones, these are carved into a Permian age sandstone, they're not real tracks. These little potholes, these are evidence of a fish feeding in soft sediments. This one, that looks like a footprint of a tetrapod, no, that's actually an arthropod feeding trace. Heck, even the first print that was actually attributed to a tetrapod isn't believed to be from a tetrapod at all anymore. Instead, it's just believed that it was some coprolites, so essentially poop, that was pushed into the sediment and then eroded away. So there's a lot of variation and a lot of interpretation that is needed when trying to study footprints. And so having a good methodology is very important for future study of them. And so these authors propose a number of steps. First, you're going to be looking for a regular track morphology. So that means you're going to have alternating foot placement of right, left, right, left, right, left. And you're going to have differentiation, if it's a 4-legged animal, of the front hand and the back hand, so the pes and the manus. And then with the morphology, you're going to be looking for how it corresponds to actual animals that we know of. Does it seem like this is the trackway that would be made by something that we do know should be living there at that time? And you want that morphology of the print to be consistent. You want multiple of the tracks to continue to show that same morphology. And finally, you want to be considering the environment. If these were ocean sediments from deep in the ocean, we could say with pretty good confidence that there wasn't a dinosaur walking across it. But since these were pretty shallow ocean environments, it's possible this was part of a tidal flat, which makes it much more reasonable that there were dinosaurs walking across it. And they actually used some of these because, like I said, only some of these prints were well preserved. And so we were able to actually make a 3D model of the platform that these fossils occur on, and we're able to actually, using that larger scale view, see the differentiation of right and left prints and the trackways that these dinosaurs would have walked. So this is a really good paper for looking at how to do studies of things you might think are footprints, but are really hard to tell for sure if they are footprints. And now jumping even further back in time to when life started to begin getting complex, we're going to be looking even before the Cambrian in the Ediacaran period. And this was a meta-community analysis, which means they're studying what fossils are there and what kind of microenvironments they would have been in. And what they found is that towards the end of the Ediacaran, there was already a lot of diversity that was beginning to develop. And so these animals weren't living in just one single place, and they weren't consistent throughout the entire environment. What this means is that a lot of the diversity we attribute to things like the Cambrian explosion may not have just been the Cambrian explosion. They may have already been developing and evolving more rapidly even before that event. Now, this doesn't mean that the Cambrian explosion wasn't real. It just means that maybe it wasn't as big of a factor in the diversity of life that we have today as we may have thought. And instead, the roots to that life may actually lay further back in the Ediacaran. And this same kind of idea is actually supported by another paper which looks at Ediacaran fossils from Namibia. And these fossils are actually mostly trace fossils, so things like worm burrows and other small things in soft sediments that helped indicate that life was there, but not actual preservation of the actual organisms. But again, there's a lot of different types of these traces within these rocks, which again suggests that they were already diversifying pretty rapidly. It wasn't a very static environment with just a handful of living things just hanging around. It was a dynamic environment with a lot of change occurring already. But once life started to diversify in the Cambrian, there were many forms that we can recognize pretty well today, including some of the animals that would become the first arthropods, things like the trilobites, specifically the genus Olenoides, which was named all the way in like 1877, but we're still finding out new things about it, in particular because of a very well-preserved specimen that actually shows a number of modified appendages. And while it just seems like these modified appendages might not be that important, it actually bears a lot of similarity to what happens in male horseshoe crabs when they're getting ready for their mating season and modify their appendages in order for clasping while mating. So what this means is that potentially some of the first arthropods, including the trilobites, had a similar strategy when mating, A, and B, it does at least lend some credence to the idea that trilobites may actually be the sister group to the chelicerates being things like horseshoe crabs and arachnids. But there's still a lot of debate that's going to be had about that because many of these early arthropod groups are very poorly understood. But hey, there's a chance at least, which is pretty interesting that we're able to get this from an animal that was named, like I said, back in 1877. Like, there's still new research to be found, even on very old fossils. So it's not all about just going out and finding new things. Sometimes you can just go inside to a museum and find something new. And moving back to the Cretaceous, we're actually looking at an arthropod, specifically a wasp, a crabronid wasp. The crabronid wasps are mostly solitary, and so wouldn't form different kinds of hives like many of the wasps that I have too much personal experience with because they seem to like stinging me, which is unfortunate. But it is still really important for understanding the environment of where this animal was found in the Crato Formation of South America. The Crato Formation is a Lagerstätte that represents a shallow lake, kind of like Lake Chad in Africa, where it's a relatively large but also relatively shallow lake, so there's a lot of evaporation occurring. This means that in some of those layers, there's very good lamination, and also it's pretty salty, so there's not as much things that can actually live there and actually decay many of these animals. So you get some really good fossils, like of these two specimens of a crabronid wasp. Named Exhalopterus spectabilis, it helps to show that the larger group the crabronids belong to, the apoid wasps, were actually pretty widespread by the Cretaceous. And this is because there's also fossils of other apoid wasps coming from the other side of the world in Myanmar, which I have a whole video on the ethics of Myanmar amber, like go check it out. But it's still important for understanding that this group of wasps was already getting very widespread. Additionally, it helps us to understand some more of the environment surrounding the Crato Formation, because these wasps don't normally live in and near lakes, normally preferring at least somewhat arid environments where they can actually burrow. So that also helps to support some evidence from the Crato Formation that the area surrounding it was pretty desert-like, and not necessarily just a rich jungle full of life. And finally, we're going to talk about 3 separate preprints, and the first actually comes from April, and I'm going to preface this with Spinosaurus is a myth, it doesn't exist, it is like the Loch Ness Monster or North Dakota. It doesn't exist. And I'm saying that because I do not understand how one single animal can cause so much discussion about what it may or may not have been doing in its environment. And I say that because there was a paper earlier this year which discussed, yeah, Spinosaurus had dense bones, clearly it fed under the water. And then there was a preprint that actually came from April that I didn't mention that goes, hey, the methods that they used in that paper that said the bones were dense aren't statistically relevant, they didn't do it right. There's another preprint that came out in May that says, yes, we did do it right. We had all of this relevant statistical information and we had a good sampling of different animals when we checked their bone density. And then there was a 4th. And now there's another preprint which says, no, they're all wrong. It's not subaqueous. It quite literally, the title of this paper is, when it's fully published, because it's still in preprint, Spinosaurus is not an aquatic dinosaur. They're using very plain language to state what their hypothesis is and what their conclusions are. There's a lot of tension that is built up in some of these academic circles when there are different hypotheses being tested, and it's really interesting, but I do think that this paper and the one from Hone and Holtz from 2021, which I actually have an entire video on, are really good summaries of why essentially it probably wasn't, at least in my opinion and many other researchers' opinion. And this new one actually uses some new methods. They were doing things like calculating how well it would have been able to propel itself through the water, with it swimming at a paltry 1.4 meters per second. And for comparison, Michael Phelps swims at about 2.1. So it's not even faster than Michael Phelps. And as much as Michael Phelps is a very good swimmer, we are not fish. You don't see adaptations like a big paddle tail like you would expect. And as much as Spinosaurus did have a paddle tail, it seems much more like it was for selection than for swimming because, again, based on muscle mass estimates, it was not going anywhere very quickly. In fact, it was going nowhere so slowly that it couldn't even produce enough thrust to drive itself under the water based on how buoyant it would have been in that water. So it seems really, really unlikely that it was hunting under the water. This paper then suggests it was hunting primarily on the banks and shallows of waterways, acting more like a heron or a stork as opposed to something that was swimming and diving after fish in the water. So it helps to promote this idea that no, it was still doing something pretty unique for dinosaurs, but not necessarily swimming like a fish. And again, Hone and Holtz, that paper still hasn't really been addressed by any of the other researchers because it is very, very thorough and looks at many different lines of evidence. So I do highly suggest that video if you want to understand more about what's happening in dialogue and scientific research about Spinosaurus. Because until someone comes out and says that what they did is wrong, I'm still inclined to believe those two researchers over anything that suggests differently, at least right now. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. More Spinosaurus stuff. Wild, right? So much angst over Spinosaurus. It's ridiculous. We still have some what the hells to get out, so we're going to be continually producing stuff. My wife is working on getting a computer fix, so once we get that done, we might try and actually do more stream stuff, but that's all up to how well everything works. So we will see how that all goes. Don't forget to check out our Patreon, where you can help vote on some of the what the hells. And also, one of them was Moz Chops, which my wife did a wonderful sketch of Moz Chops with mutton chops. And you can buy it on shirts from Redbubble or on stickers. It's fantastic. It is. I love it. With that in mind, everyone, be safe, take care, don't go extinct.